One of my brothers-in-law is a builder and a contractor. He lives in Texas. One summer, when my family and I were in the U.S. from Brazil, we were visiting my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, and John, my brother-in-law, asked me if I would be willing to help him hang, tape, and float the drywall ceiling of a deck that he had built out of the back of their house. Now, I should add that I had never previously been exposed to any kind of drywall work at all, let alone a ceiling, let alone in Texas in late July. So I had a vague idea of what was entailed, but I had zero concept of what the reality of trying to hang this drywall would be. Now, for those of you who have never done drywall work, you can't relate. Ask someone who has. After about 3 to 4 hours, somewhere in there, gallons of sweat, intense frustration on my brother-in-law's part and my part with my own incompetence, we had hung 1.5, 2 sheets. And I remember we were lying on our backs on the scaffolding, looking at this really poor job. And my brother-in-law said, "I'm paying someone to do the rest. Let's go inside." Jesus has issued an invitation to all humanity to become his disciple. Anyone who wants to. Now, unlike the situation with my brother-in-law, however, Jesus lays out clearly for us what that means. What will it look like to be his disciple? There's no bait and switch. If you do not have a hard copy Bible with you this morning and you'd like to borrow one so you can follow along in the service, the ushers are coming back down the aisles now with some copies. If you just raise your hand or catch their eye, they'd be glad to give you one. If you don't own your own Bible, then please don't just borrow this one. Accept it as a gift from us. Take it, read it, make it your own. I'm going to be reading some of Jesus' words from the Gospel of Mark. If you're not familiar with the Bible as a book, the New Testament, which is about the second 1/3 of the Bible, the New Testament begins with 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were 4 authors who each wrote down some of their highlights of Jesus' life while he was on earth. These are not biographies. They don't come anywhere close to describing everything that Jesus said or did or taught. But they are some highlights that these 4 individuals understood, empowered, and inspired by the Holy Spirit to preserve for us today. So I'm going to be reading a few verses from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. And the context is we're picking up right where we left off 2 Sundays ago, for those of you who were here. Immediately after Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And if you remember, Peter immediately speaks up and says, "You're the Messiah." Jesus says, "That's right, don't tell anybody." And then shortly thereafter, Jesus has to rebuke Peter because even though Peter got it right, he was the Messiah, he had no concept of the kind of Messiah that Jesus had come to be. So after those events, this is what Jesus says next. Mark 8:34 through 37. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will find it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" This invitation that Jesus makes is immediately followed by an explanation of what that's going to look like, what discipleship to him will look like. The first thing I want us to note, though, is that to whom does Jesus make this invitation? He's with his disciples, but then he says he broadens that circle because he calls all the crowds to him as well. That's important Because this invitation to being a disciple of Jesus, it's not just for an inner circle, it's not just for super Christians, it's for everyone. And there are two groups represented here this morning that I want to address. The first of those are the ones here who have already, at some point, made your initial response of yes to Christ's invitation to be his disciple. And I hope that this morning would be a reminder and a re-energizing experience to us, and that we would recommit ourselves to that life of discipleship. The other group is those of you who have not yet said your initial yes to Jesus. I want to make sure that you know that this morning he is still issuing that invitation to you. And as I've already said, it's an invitation to be a disciple. The Bible actually does not have a category for someone who is a Christian or a believer or a follower of Jesus, whatever word you want to use, who is not a disciple. There is no category or context for such a person. If you have said yes to Jesus, you are a disciple. We may be lousy disciples, but we are disciples. So there's no hierarchy or tier. And a disciple encompasses all of these things. To be in relationship with Jesus is to be his disciple. There's no other category. Also, this is an invitation, right? It's not a coercion. All of the crowds then and all of us today are free to reject this invitation. But we are not free to define what true discipleship will look like. So we either say yes to the invitation as Jesus makes it, or we say no. But we don't say yes, but I want to modify this clause and this phrase, and I want to add some small writing here at the bottom. And then Jesus heads into 3 actions that will define the life of a disciple to him. The first one is to deny self. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. Now, I know that for those of you who have some kind of church background, you're probably very familiar with this passage. And my desire is just that you would be re-challenged by the love and invitation of Jesus. In every life, in every soul, there's a throne, the seat of authority. And each of us, every human being, we're conceived and then later born with self on that throne. And this isn't anything new. This isn't something I have to tell you about, because any decision we make, any choice we face, any situation into which we are entering, there is always a script in our minds. How is this going to affect me? What is this going to require of me? How much is this going to cost me? What am I going to have to give up in order to enter into this? Am I going to get anything out of it or not? Being ruled by self means that decisions and priorities are all ordered according to what self wants. With self on the throne, I'm self-oriented in my thoughts, decisions, values, and priorities. But Jesus says that if we decide to be his disciple, we must deny self. So to deny self is to remove self from the thrones of our hearts, the seat of highest authority, and offer that throne to the Almighty God. And with that offering comes a reordering of priorities. Not what I want, but what God wants. Jesus led the way for us in this, in the Garden of Gethsemane. You've heard these words many times. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. We become God-oriented rather than self-oriented. I also want to be clear that denying self doesn't mean always doing the opposite of what you want to do. We are very easily attracted to rigid grids and formulas. We may not like them. At least we may not like to live by them, but we like to know they're there because we always want to be able to see, this is the way, this is not. So it's easier to say, okay, denying self means any decision I face, I'm going to do the opposite of what I want to do. That's not what it means to deny self. Denying self means that the decisions are laid before the Lord. And his character guides us. Because denying self doesn't mean denying our personhood or our personality or our preferences. But it means submitting all of those to Christ. Self-denial, it has a beginning but not an end, because this is an ongoing daily choice. I don't remember where I first heard this phrase. I didn't come up with it. I wish I remember so I could give credit to the person. But denying self is a daily exchange of wills. Every day recommitting, not my will, but yours be done. And then Jesus follows by saying that the next action of a disciple is going to be that they will take up their cross. This was not a Jewish saying, because the cross was an imported means of execution from the Romans. So Jesus making that statement actually would have been repulsive, very shocking. We have become very, very conversant and familiar with the symbol of the cross. Obviously, this morning, we have 2 on the stage. If we were to count how many necklaces there are out there with crosses on them, we'd probably be into the hundreds. Tattoos of crosses, then we're into the thousands. We see them everywhere. It's no longer shocking to us. So maybe for us to get a little taste of what Jesus listeners would have heard then, we would say something like, every day, take up your lethal injection. Every day, take up your electric chair. Every day, take up your hangman's noose, your guillotine. It was a stark, ugly, painful image of death. It wasn't beautiful and comforting. Because what Jesus is communicating is this whole thing about self, denying self, is that self doesn't need to just be diminished or quieted or contained. Self needs to die. Because self is always going to be trying to climb back up on that throne. And self is going to say things like, I don't need the whole throne. Just give me a little corner. Just give me a little corner. God knows the deceitfulness of self. And this is why the Apostle Paul writes in a letter that he wrote to the Christians in a city called, or a region called Galatia, Galatians 2:20, he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. That's that picture. It's like self. I can't just allow self to be contained. Self has to die with Jesus on the cross, so that I can be born anew through Christ's resurrection. And self doesn't go without a fight. It's a lifelong fight that we're going to face as long as we live here. And I suggest, here's just one image or suggestion of how we might go about putting self to death, taking up our cross, is by starving self. We don't give it what it wants. We don't feed it. We refuse to cater to its desires. In my early 20s, I decided that given my many bad eating habits, there was one that I had decided to be, tough and macho about. I was going to cut out all soft drinks, pop, Coke, whatever you call it. Not going to have any of it. I was going to go cold turkey. Now, this came on the heels of quite a long addiction. In high school, the school that I attended had a student-run concession stand. It was called the Pop Shop, and it was open before school in the morning. It was open at lunch. It was open after school. And I had managed to weasel my way into the leadership of this Pop Shop, my junior and senior year. The reason, my main motivation, of course, to the student body, I gave the speech about wanting to serve, blah, 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 everything. The real reason was, as long as you were working there, you could consume all you wanted. And so there was, soft drinks and ice cream and chips and candy and chocolate. It was wonderful. So at that time, we sold Coke in liter bottles, 1 liter, it's about a quart, for those of you who aren't up on your metric system. So that was the perfect size, 1 quart, one before school, one at lunch, one before sports practice, one after sports practice. It was great. So I decided early 20s, okay, I'm stopping, cold turkey. Now, coffee was already on the horizon. It was already blessing me, but the first time that I had pizza with water. Like all of life was just gray. There was just no joy. Meal times were depressing. And that desire and pull for the Coke was very strong. And just to be clear, it was actual Coke. I know anyway. Coca-Cola, let me make that clear also. It was very strong for a long time. But over the course of time, starving that desire, right? Starving that self, if you want to call it that, it did grow less intense. It had a lesser and lesser hold over me. And that desire for it became less frequent over time. There were moments of failure along the way. I'm not suggesting that there were not. But I also want to remind us in our lives of discipleship with Christ, a failure, which we will all experience, doesn't mean that your commitment to Him changes or ends. That's a lie that the enemy whispers to us a lot, right? If you failed, then you're disqualified. The whole point of the cross is that no one is disqualified by their own sin. So even with failures, we commit by the grace of God and by His power to stand up and to continue our life with Him. The final action of discipleship that Jesus describes to the crowd, to His disciples, is that they are to follow Him. That's the worst it's ever been. And I'm particularly disappointed because I have friends from Brazil with me here this morning, and I was hoping we'd do a good showing. Brazil. Thank you. I stopped by a mechanic shop that was near our home, and it was kind of a specialized place, so I hadn't been there before. And as I was talking with the owner of the shop about what I needed done on the car, somehow we discovered that we had an acquaintance in common. It was actually a colleague of mine, a good friend. His name is Dave, and he's a missionary and a pastor, and he had planted a church not too far away, and the church was doing well and growing. And the mechanic said, "Oh, you know Pastor Dave?" And I said, "Yes, he's a good friend. I've known him since I was a child." And we shared about him, and this mechanic just started talking about how much he loved Pastor Dave and how much he loved Pastor Dave's church, and it was so good to be a part of that community. And we talked for about 15 minutes, and then just kind of off the cuff, I said, "So this is so encouraging. It's like, for how long have you been part of that church?" And he said, "Well, this last Sunday was my first time to go." Is it possible that we overstate the reality of our following Christ? So is it possible that we say, "Oh yeah, I follow Jesus," but spiritually speaking, we're just sitting in our Barcalounger, and we really don't have any idea where He's gone? Because following Him is far more than just saying, "I'm a follower." So very quickly, just 3 potential descriptors of a follower. First, a follower knows who they're following. So we've got to have some idea, right? Because we got to know, we got to be able to identify the one that we're following. How can we follow an unknown? I've talked to you before about the crazy traffic in São Paulo, where we lived. And before GPS and cell phones, I remember driving and following somebody in another car to a destination that I didn't know. I didn't know how to get there. And before going, we'd always have a little conference, okay? What car are you driving? What color is it? Let me see it. What's your license number? Why? Because I've got to be able to know exactly which one it is. I don't have time to go into all of this, but how does one initially come to know Jesus and then grow in that knowledge? How does that happen? Briefly, and these are generalities, but 3 general ways. First of all, by God's Spirit Himself. When we first say yes to Jesus, "I want to be your disciple. I accept what you did on the cross in my place. I'm a sinner. I need your redemption. I need your forgiveness. I need new life in you. When we make that first decision, that first step, Scripture teaches that the Spirit of God literally comes to live within that disciple, that person. That's why Paul wrote, remember in that Galatians, that Christ, I no longer live, but Christ himself lives in me. By his Spirit, by his word, we know him more and more as we study and immerse ourselves and apply ourselves to his word. And thirdly, through his body, which is the community of believers, the community of disciples, the church. Secondly, a follower gazes at the one they're following. They don't just glance, they gaze. It's so easy to be distracted. It's so easy to just unintentionally drift away. And just to use that same analogy of following someone through the traffic of São Paulo, you got to gaze at that car. The other day, I think I was up on North Main. I had a moment where I reverted to my Brazilian self. Because I was in the left-hand lane, I needed to get into the right-hand lane. And I looked in the mirror, and I realized there was a car coming up on the right, but I had 1.5 car lengths between me and them. Now, in São Paulo, you need about 3/4 of a car length. Everyone's good with it? Turn on your turn signal, you merge, no problem. Apparently, 1.5 car lengths in North Canton is not enough. The person behind me let me know that, loudly and extendedly. If that was you, I apologize. Sorry. Dark blue Toyota Sienna, scratched on the driver's side. Not really, that's my sister's car. Honda Odyssey. But the point is that in that kind of traffic in Brazil, if you allow just a little bit of drift, just a little bit of space, a car is going to squeeze in, and then another one, and another one. And just a little bit of distraction, if we're not gazing and focused upon that car in front, we're going to get lost, we're going to get separated. We're invited to gaze at Jesus. A follower gazes at him. Because becoming a follower of Jesus, being a follower is not just about one prayer. And I think sometimes we've bought into that self-deception. That, 20 years ago I said a prayer, and so I'm a follower of Jesus. Saying that prayer might begin our lives of discipleship. But following is ongoing. Following isn't one step, it's a lifetime commitment to gazing at Jesus. And then thirdly, a follower moves where the one they're following is moving to. Because following Jesus, it's going to affect our actions, our decisions, our thought processes, our priorities. We go where Jesus goes, we do what Jesus does. Eugene Peterson wrote a book, and the title of that book, I think, encapsulates this idea. It's a long obedience in the same direction. Following is for life. And it moves us because we move with Jesus. And I just relate 2 blessings that come with this image of following. There are many others, but the first is that followers are blessed with relationship, not rules. Relationship, not rules. And maybe your impression of being a disciple of Jesus is that you're given a list of rules, and you follow those rules, and that makes you a good disciple. Is that what Jesus just said here? Did he say you follow the rules and you're a good disciple? He said, no, follow me. Don't follow the rules, follow me. So imagine, those of you who are currently in some kind of romantic relationship or marriage, the two aren't always the same, or you have been, or but think about back to those days, the initial days of that relationship when there's high emotion and excitement. Now imagine that at that point you were handed a sheet of paper and it was the rules for how to please this other person in whom you're interested. But then you never see or communicate with that person again. So all you have is this list of stuff that they like. And so you're doing it. You're following the rules. You follow the rules, follow the rules, follow the rules, and never have any interaction with that person. That's not a relationship. That's legalism, and it's dry, and it's impossible, and it's meaningless. But that's how many of us approach a relationship with Jesus, discipleship to Jesus. I don't know where he is, but I've got this list of rules, and I'm going to follow it, and I'm going to try hard, and I'm going to be good. And my effort to be good is going to be enough, and it's not. Jesus said to his disciples, "Follow me." That meant literally being with him, walking with him, going where he went, listening to him, talking to him, questioning him, interacting with him. That's what being a disciple of Jesus is. It's knowing God and being known by him. It's not following a list of rules. Now, within the context of a relationship, we learn what pleases that person. And because we love them, we do what pleases them as opposed to the things that they hate. So as we come to know Jesus, yes, we do act in ways and make choices that please him. But it's because we're in relationship, not to try to be in relationship. The second blessing is that Jesus is the one carrying us even as we follow him. It's Jesus who makes it possible for us to follow. Again, the image of following someone through the streets of São Paulo, my dad was the best person to follow. He made it as easy as anyone could make it, because first there would be a strategy session before we set out. And we would talk through strategy and application, how we're going to do this. And then he was ultra hyper aware of the location of the car following him. And he would think ahead. He'd see a light that turns yellow, and he'd go ahead and stop. Usually that's a symbol in Brazil, step on it. But he would go ahead and stop because he knew the person behind him wasn't going to get through. He was always aware. And Christ not only is aware of where we are, he's with us. He makes it possible for us to follow. I have been crucified with Christ, says Paul. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So I just want to end this morning with a cost-benefit analysis. Because the cost of becoming Jesus' disciple, we just read it, it's everything, right? It's life. Deny self, take up your cross, follow. Everything I am, laid at his feet, given to him, my past, future, present, dreams, fears, talents, failures, hopes, sins, everything. But I look at these three actions, and so far, this does not look like a very attractive proposition. Hey, man, you want to come over tomorrow and hang out? We're going to deny self, take up our crosses, and follow Jesus. This would be a ridiculous price if the benefit were anything less than it is. So if Jesus were anyone else, then this price would not be worth paying. And Jesus puts it this way: what good is it for someone to gain the whole world? So yeah, keep self on the throne and gain everything this world has to offer, and then forfeit your soul. Lose your life. So imagine you're scuba diving in the ocean, find a shipwreck, you make your way in through it. Turns out it's an old Spanish galleon, and there's a huge chest of golden Spanish doubloons. And you're like, I'm set for life. I'm set for life, and all my descendants are set for life. You try to lift that chest, you can't lift it. It's too heavy, even with the negative buoyancy of water and everything. But you're like, I'm not giving this up. Look at all this treasure. And you hang on to it, and you hang on to it, and your gauges show that your air pressure is getting lower and lower and lower until finally all the air is gone. You suffocate, you die, but you hung on to that gold. that gold had no benefit to you. And that's the image that Jesus gives us of hanging on to our own lives. Instead of releasing them to him, you can hang on to it. You can get stuff that this world offers, but your life's going to come to an end. Your soul is going to be forfeit. Jesus says, and it was the gospel writer Matthew who wrote this down, speaking of describing the incredible value of Christ and the kingdom of heaven. Two images that he gives real quickly in Matthew 13. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Jesus is worth it. So what if I were to come to you and say, hey, I've got something for you, but the cost is your home. You need to sign over your house to me. I want the deed clear and free in my name. Now, if I actually did that to you, you might chuckle, you might laugh, you might go to a different church. But then there's the rest of the story. You sign over your house to me, and in return, you're going to get a 10-bedroom mansion, all with their own suites, right? All maintenance and taxes covered for life, comes with full-time gardener and landscaper, no charges for utilities, full-time cook and cleaning staff covered for life. I'll throw in, 4 or 5 vehicles of your choice as well. Suddenly, the cost of giving up your current home doesn't seem quite so high. And if our eyes are on the price, then we're totally missing out on Jesus because he's worth it. He's worth it. That's what Easter Sunday morning is about. The fact that he has conquered sin and death. He died in our place. He beat death, and he offers to take our lives that we're going to lose anyway and give us his never-ending life in return. Who do I say he is? Who do we say he is? The only one worthy of my worship, of my life, of everything that I am. And in light of who he is and what he has done, and in the reality of the depth of my own sin and depravity, the cost, right, denying self, taking up my cross, following him, even though that's a great cost, in light of what we stand to gain, is minimal. If you have never said that initial yes to Jesus, I want you to hear that invitation very clearly this morning. And I want you to catch a glimpse of the cost, but beyond that, of the reward. The one who hangs on to their lives will lose it. The one who gives up their lives for the sake of Christ and the gospel will gain it. This morning, we're celebrating 8 water baptisms. And this is a decision that these 8 people have made. That choice to say, I choose to be a disciple of Jesus. I am choosing to live a lifestyle of discipleship, to deny self, take up my cross, follow him. Water baptism is one of the ways that we publicly state, I belong to Jesus. I'm all in. My sinful nature has been crucified with Christ, and I've been raised again, a new creation through Christ's resurrection.